Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, Salma Yaqub. In the first half of today's show, we'll be discussing the phone hacking scandal, which last night claimed its latest scalp, that of Britain's most senior police officer, Sir Paul Stephenson. He resigned over claims that the police hadn't done enough to investigate allegations of phone hacking by the News of the World newspaper, and that police officers had accepted money from Rupert Murdoch's now defunct paper. He left office hours after the arrest of former News of the World editor Rebecca Brooks on Sunday in connection with the investigation. The crisis, which has seen News International apologise to the parents of murdered British schoolgirl, has shocked the British public and rocked News Corp, Murdoch's media empire. Well, before I introduce this week's guests, let's take a quick look at some of the latest events.
It's a scandal that shocked the British public, and last night it claimed its latest victim.
Home Secretary and
Britain's most senior police officer, the head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Paul Stephenson, resigned as he continued to face allegations that police officers had accepted money from Rupert Murdoch's News of the World newspaper and hadn't done enough to investigate phone hacking charges.
I had no knowledge of or involvement in the original investigation into phone hacking in 2006 that successfully led to the conviction and imprisonment of 2 men. I had no reason to believe this was anything other than a successful operation. I was unaware that there were any other documents in our possession of the nature that have now emerged. I have acknowledged the statement by John Yates that if he had known then what he knows now, he would have done things differently. My relationship with
Stephenson also said that he didn't want criticism of his conduct to detract from ensuring security at the Olympic Games, which are due to be held in London next year. His resignation came hours after the arrest of Rebecca Brooks. Brooks herself had just resigned as chief executive of News International, which is the British arm of Murdoch's News Corp. She was editor of News of the World during the time of the alleged phone hacking, but denies any knowledge of what was said to have been happening. The paper was forced to shut down last week as advertisers started to desert it in the wake of the allegations. It's claimed that a wide array of phones were hacked by investigators working for the paper, including those of celebrities and even those of a murdered schoolgirl. Murdoch has personally apologised to the family of Millie Dowler, but the scandal and crisis engulfing his News Corp is far from over. It's raised concerns about unethical media practices and about the influence which Murdoch has wielded over British political leaders, and News Corp is set to face fresh investigations into the alleged hacking.
Well, with me to discuss this issue is Mark Seddon, a British journalist who has written extensively for a number of publications, including The Guardian, The Independent, Daily Mail, The Spectator, and The New Statesman. He was also the former UN correspondent for Al Jazeera. Thank you and welcome to the programme. I'm also joined by a senior lecturer in Media and Sociology at the University of Northampton, Dr Noureddine Miladi. Thank you and welcome to the programme. If I can turn to you first, Mark, do you think this crisis is not just a crisis for Murdoch, but for the media in general?
It's certainly a crisis for sections of the British media. I mean, the focus so far has been on News Corporation, News International in Britain. But I've absolutely no doubt there will be other claims made about other newspapers and similar practices. I don't think there's any question of that. It's just a question of time. Yes, it's quite clear that we have in Britain a self-regulation of the media. We have an organisation called the Press Complaints Commission. We have a very strong belief in freedom of the press. But what we have seen over the past 30 years is an increasing monopolisation of media. And as you were mentioning, as the package was mentioning, a sort of much greater political influence of one or two big media moguls. And that has been a corrupting influence, and self-regulation has clearly failed. And Murdoch in particular, his organisation, has, we now know, been engaged in the most appalling practices.
Well, why do you think it's taken this long? We're hearing words like corrupting influence. It's not new that Murdoch owned this much percentage of Britain's media. And now suddenly lots of commentators are highlighting that fact. If it's been corrupting for years, why has this issue not come to light before?
Well, I think there's a difference between the alleged corrupt practices and illegal practices. I mean, Rebecca Brooks may be charged with perverting the course of justice. She may be charged with corruption. Who knows? But what we do know is that hacking into cell phones is illegal. And also what we do know is paying policemen for information is illegal. There's no question of that. Now, a corrupting influence on the body politic is, of course, something quite separate. Mm-hmm. I would certainly argue, because I'm a veteran of those times. I was on the picket lines in Wapping when News Corporation moved overnight and fired 5,000 workers in order to set up its News International plant. And I watched from Margaret Thatcher through to Blair and now to Cameron how effectively the power of this media mogul has influenced them. And they have actually, I mean, Tony Blair is a classic example because all political figures in this country, whether Conservative or Labour for 30 years, have believed that Murdoch holds the key to power. You have to court his newspapers.
Well, he claims it's the son that wins general elections.
He did,
Whether that's true or whether they have to get on the back of public opinion and then claim victory, you know, is something that's worth debating. You've been nodding your head there. Would you agree that there has been an undue political influence due to Murdoch's empire?
I mean, certainly when we think about the history, for instance, of the relationship of some of the tabloids with political leadership or political parties in this country, I think we can recall at least the 1997 election where Labour came with a landslide kind of victory. And it's been claimed at the time, I remember very well, and we kind of recall that the Sun newspaper, when it made that switch from Conservative to Labour, it played a vital role in probably providing a kind of a win. That was one of the historical moments. Now probably the Sun is playing a different role nowadays with being probably pro-conservative or stuff like this. But yes, I think historically, I mean, with the kind of noticeable growth of the Murdoch empire, be it broadcasting or the press or magazines and so forth, I think it's been claimed that there is a growing influence, and I think this has been kind of the discussion of the behind the doors kind of talk, but nowadays I think it's become very, very obvious in front of us. It used
to seem the stuff almost of conspiracy theories. You know, we have a controlled media, which is one of the things we're very proud of in Britain, that we have a free press, and yet we have, for example, Robert Fisk, who wrote just last week that he left the Times because he felt, for example, on the issue of Israel, there was direct editorial interference. Although Rupert Murdoch may not have changed words, there was a certain editorial policy which was followed, which was very much pro-Israel and very critical of anybody pro-Palestinian. Would you agree with that kind of sentiment?
Well, you know, proprietors, of course, influence newspapers, and there's no doubt. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory; it's a simple fact. I mean, Rupert Murdoch has been close to several Israeli leaders. I mean, he's sympathetic, essentially, is essentially to the Israeli case. Does that would that mean that he censors everything or his paper? No, of course not. But I mean, there will be on occasions, and we know this from Fleet Street and newspapers, if particular journalists step out of line too much, they may suffer consequences. I mean, if Robert Fisk says that, I'm sure that's the truth. But the point, going back to what you were just saying about the influence of the Murdoch press, I think it has been exaggerated by politicians in a way, because actually public opinion has often led the popular newspapers. And there's no way in 1997, for instance, the Sun would say vote Conservative. It would have been absolutely crazy. But what happened before then is deeply corrupting, because Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell, as it keeps on getting mentioned on the media here, flew off to Australia to meet with Murdoch and his executives. They came back, and this is what they never tell you, and they completely changed the Labour Party's policy on restricting cross-media ownership. They dropped it. And I'm afraid we were seeing exactly the same happening with David Cameron and allowing Murdoch to buy into B-Sky B. 26 meetings Cameron has had with Murdoch's people since he's been elected. I mean, whose creature is he?
Who he chose to be his PR man, as it were, despite knowing he'd resigned from the News of the World. Do you think this crisis is now becoming closer and closer to David Cameron? We've had some very high-profile arrests with Rebecca Wade, and now the resignation of the police Met Chief. But do you think David Cameron cannot escape and keep that distance now?